One of the most beautiful aspects of music is that it can be extremely simple, yet it can also be wildly complex, and I love that about music. Now, the native flute at its heart is really an improvisational instrument, and there's no musical experience or theory needed to play it. You can play a lifetime of music and be creative by just playing from the heart. Now, that said, if you are interested in learning more and delving into a little bit of theory, this section on basic theory is going to be for you. Now, I'm going to start pretty simple, and what I'm going to start with is what a note is. And a note is just a name that we've given, it's a convention, to a sound. So it's a way of referencing what a sound is while talking about it. So for example, an A, this is an A. So that sound is referenced when we're talking about music as A, where this sound is G. So again, we reference that sound as G. And this gives us a way to talk about notes and sounds. Now, the next thing you'll want to understand is what a scale is. And a scale is a specific set of notes. Now, throughout the world, there's a wide variety of scales, and each has its own, each idea what it's based in, and each has its own style and feel. And that's the beauty of scales, is they all have their own feel and their own style. Now, in Western music, there's a special scale, and it's what all the other scales are built from, and it's called the chromatic scale, and it contains all the notes of Western music. And so you have the chromatic scale, and then from that, you would take subsets of notes to build other scales that you would actually play music in. You wouldn't really play in the chromatic scale. The subsets that we build, the scales that we build out of it, are what we actually play in. Now, when we talk about what different octaves are, what we're talking about is the same note, but at different pitches. And the way that works on a really applied level is this. So this is the key of A, and we'll call this middle A, and this is the middle A. Now, the same note in a higher pitch is going to be this A, a pocket flute A. And what's happening is it's still A, but the vibration doubles, and so it's a higher pitched A. So that's just a doubling of vibration, so that's a high-pitched A. And the same thing as you go down. This is our contrabass A, and this is, if you take that middle A, this is half the vibration. So we go down a step, and it's a lot deeper A, but it's still A. So because of this, because they're all related by multiples of the same number, then each one will vibrate in synchronicity and they sound nice together. They all are the same frequency, or they're all the same note. And what that sounds like when you can play them all together is this. And they harmonize, but they're all different pitches. Now, a more technical version of that same thing is if we start throwing some numbers in, and I'll do that real quick here. So A, middle A in music, it vibrates at 440 hertz. It's a vibration. Where the next A up, like what we heard on the pocket flute A, is the next one up, and that vibrates at 880 hertz. So it's a doubling. You double 440, you get 880. And the same the other way, our contrabass A is a little bit deeper, and that's vibrating at 220. If you take half of 440, you get down to 220, and again, it's still an A, but it's a multiple of, and it's a little deeper A. And so that's more of a technical way that they're all related. You don't really need to know that. I think the applied version is really the most useful, but it's kind of nice to know some of the basic mathematics behind it as well. Music is all math-based, and it's a really interesting part of it. This is where these 3 different pitched A notes are on the piano. The intervals between each of these A notes, again, is called an octave. For example, this is A middle, and this is A high, and this is A low. So between A middle and A high is 1 octave. Between A middle and A low is another octave, and A low to A high is 2 octaves apart. So you can see how a piano is really helpful because it's a very visual instrument. So you can really see how these notes are related and how music works. Now I just used A as an example, but this applies to all the notes. So for example, this is G, and so if I play this G, and if we play the lower G on a contrabass, this is half of that vibration. So it's still G, but it's a low G. And another example would be, this is a D. And if we play the next deeper note, D, this is the bass D. Again, it's half of that vibration, or that other one is double this vibration. So one way this applies to playing flutes is when you're playing with other people and you're playing with other instruments, and especially when playing different flutes, or 2 people are playing flutes together. If you're playing different octaves, like a high D and a bass D together, that's why all the notes sound good together, is because it's all the same notes, it's just a doubling of that vibration. And so they all harmonize together. So it sounds really nice. Now, the native flute is primarily a 1-octave instrument. Now that you understand what octaves are, you kind of understand what that is. So this bass D really stays within that 1-octave range. It can go a little bit above it, but it can't go below it. And so that's why each flute is keyed, so that we can get all these different octaves and you can get all these different sounds. Now one way the idea of octaves is applied to native flutes, and why it's a nice thing to know, is if 2 people are playing flutes together, and why we often will tell people that you'll want to play the flutes that are in the same key is because all the notes will harmonize with each other. Now if you're in the same octave, right, if you're both playing bass flutes, which would both bass D, like this flute, then you're both in the same octave and you're essentially playing the same frequency. The notes are all the same frequency, and so they're all going to harmonize together. But if you wanted to play a higher pitched flute with a lower pitched flute, like let's say a bass D with the higher pitched D, then again, they're still related because it's a doubling of that vibration. And so because of that, they'll harmonize with each other. And so each note will sound good with the other flute. And so it's a nice way of understanding why that actually occurs and why you can play those flutes together. So to recap, a note is the name that we give to a sound, and it's a naming convention, and it allows us to talk about sounds. A scale is a specific set of notes. In Western music, we have a chromatic scale, which includes all the notes available in Western music, and the scales are built out of that as a subset of notes, and we'll go over that more in a little bit. The beauty of scales, different scales, is that each one has its own style and feel. So it allows music to be really diverse and create different feelings. Now we went over octaves, and octaves are a specific set of pitches. So when we look at the piano, it's a very visual instrument. This is 1 octave, and it's a specific set of pitches. Now if we go 1 octave up, this is a different specific set of pitches. And each note within each octave is either a doubling or a half. It's a multiple of each other. So A in this octave is one vibration, and A in this octave is a multiple of it. It's a doubling or a halving of it. And that's the same for all the different notes. So an octave is a specific set of pitches. So now you have a better understanding of what a note is, what a scale is, and what octaves are. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about scales. And scales are really important in music because it's the way you create different feel and variety to the sound and style. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the chromatic scale in Western music is the overarching scale that consists of all the notes available in Western music. Now, all the other scales in Western music are a subset of that scale. So you would take a subset of notes, specific notes, and you would build another scale. Now, here's an example of what I mean. Here, I have taken a subset of the chromatic scale to make a pentatonic scale, which is the same basic scale that the native flute plays in. In this case, it's an F sharp minor pentatonic scale. Now we know it's an F sharp scale because the root note, this note here, is F sharp. Now the root note is the starting note of the scale, and in general is also the note the scale is named after. So that's really important. So let me say that again. So we know this is an F sharp scale because the root note, the first note in the scale, is F sharp. And the root note is the starting note, and in general is also the note that the scale is named after. Now here's another example of a minor pentatonic scale. This time it's in the key of A. And as you can see, this root note, the first note in the scale, is A. And so we call it an A minor pentatonic scale. And the minor pentatonic part has to do with what subset of notes we take out of the chromatic scale. And here is another example. This is a G minor pentatonic scale. And again, the root note here is G, so we call it a G minor pentatonic scale. So you can see that a scale consists of a subset of all the notes of the chromatic scale. And so that subset is what we actually play music in. One way that the concept of a root note applies to the native flute is it's the note that the flute is named after. That's the key of the flute. You often will see and hear us talking about the key of a specific flute, like this is the key of G, or that's the key of A, or the key of D. And what it is the root note of that flute. So this is the key of G, and so when you play the lowest note on this flute, it's a G. That's the root note for this flute. The key of D, you play the root note on a flute that's in the key of D, and it's going to be a D, that lowest note. So for the native flute, they're always referenced by the root note, the lowest note that the flute will play. Key of blank, key of A, key of G, key of F sharp, all the different keys. We'll often get the question, well, why do I want to play in different scales? And I've touched on the answer, but the answer is that each scale has its own style and its own feel, and will invoke different melodies and will allow you to express yourself musically depending on how you're feeling and what it is that you want to play, what you want to express. And so I'll give you a couple examples. So this is a G flute, and so it's a native flute, so it's based in a pentatonic minor scale like all the flutes are. And this is that pentatonic minor scale. So that's just straight up and down the scale, and it has a certain feel to it. This is a melody, like just a make it up as you go kind of melody playing on this scale. So it's a certain feel to it. It's got that real native feel. Now, here's a totally different scale. The same flute, a different subset of notes that I'm playing on this scale, on this flute. And so this is a blues variation scale. So it's a type of blues scale. And this is the scale. This is straight up and down. Right off the bat, you could feel it's really different. And so this is a melody within that scale. totally different feel. It's got that kind of bluesy, jazzy feel to it. It's really different. It's just the same flute, different scale. And that's really the beauty of scales. So to recap, the scales that we play music in are a subset of specific notes taken from the chromatic scale. Each scale has its own feeling and its own style and allows for its own creative expression and allows you to play and express yourself more creative musically. Now the root note is the first note in the scale, and it's the note that the scales are often named after. Key of F sharp pentatonic minor. Now it's also the note of the flutes in the Native American flute world. So you have a flute in the key of D or the key of A or whatever key it is, and that again is the root note of that flute. Now in the next section we'll go over how scales are built. How do you choose that subset of notes in order to create a scale that you would play in? The native flute is a chromatic instrument. And what that means is that within the octave range that this flute will play, you can play all the notes in the chromatic scale. So, for example, this is the chromatic scale on a flute in the key of A. Now what that means is because you can play this range of chromatic notes, you can take subsets of that and create other scales, of which the pentatonic minor is one of them. It just happens to be that that's what it's based in. So when you play straight up and down the flute, you get that scale. But if you start learning other fingerings, we can start playing other scales as well. Now I've referenced a lot that the chromatic scale is this overarching scale, and that the scales that we play music in are a subset of that scale. But how do you know which notes to pull from the chromatic scale in order to build a scale that you'd actually play music in? And in order to do this, we'll need to define what the distance is between each note in the chromatic scale. This gives us a convention to talk about when we're talking about building scales. Now we call the interval from any note to the next note up or down a half step. For example, if you look here, from G to G sharp is a half step. From G sharp to A is another half step. From A to A sharp is another half step. A sharp to B is another half step. So each of these half steps is the one note to the next nearest note in the chromatic scale. Now, as you can imagine, 2 half steps equal what we call a whole step. So, and then 3 half steps equals what we call a step and a half, 1 whole step and a half step, and so on. Now, we haven't really talked about sharps or flats. Most notes have a counterpart that's either a sharp or a flat version of itself. And what that references is that half step. A to A sharp is a half step up. A to G sharp is a half step down. And in general, we usually always talk about sharps when it comes to the native flute. And so because of that, you won't really hear me referencing flats. The only flute in the native flute world that really references flats is a B flat flute. Now one interesting thing to note is that neither E nor B have a sharp counterpart to them. There's no such thing as E sharp or B sharp. All the other notes have that sharp counterpart. So while a half step up from A is A sharp, a half step up from B is C, and a half step up from E is F. And this is just a naming convention. So this is just part of the foundation of Western music. So now with that understanding, let's build a scale. To build a scale from the chromatic scale, you will need to know the step pattern of the scale you're building. So each scale has a specific step pattern to it. For example, the step pattern for the pentatonic scale is 1.5 steps, a whole step, 1.5 steps, and a whole step. So knowing this pattern, I'll build an A minor pentatonic scale from the chromatic scale. So again, we reference the root note, which is in this case A. So we start at A, we go 1.5 steps up, or 3 half steps, which gives us C. From C, we go 1 whole step up, which is again is 2 half steps, which gives us D. We go another whole step, that gives us E. A step and a half gives us G. And the final step brings us back to the root note A. So the A minor pentatonic scale is A, C, D, E, G, A. And those would be the notes that you would play if you were playing in that scale. You would skip all the other notes. You would just play A, C, D, E, G, and A. Any combination thereof, you would switch back and forth between them just like we do when we're playing a melody on the native flute, but you wouldn't play other notes within that, and that's how you play that specific scale. Now this is what that scale sounds like, right? This is an A pentatonic minor flute. It just so happens that the way the flute is built, it follows that step pattern by just walking straight up the flute. So you don't have to skip any notes, or the perception is you're not skipping notes because those are the holes that you're opening. But you actually are, because the flute is not innately, without doing some other kind of fingerings, playing any of the other notes. So that makes it really easy to play the pentatonic minor scale on the native flute. Now let's build a G minor pentatonic scale, this scale here. Again, the basic scale on the native flute. So we start with the root note, which is G. From there we go 1.5 steps up. Remember, that's 3 half steps. So we go from G to A sharp. Then we go 1 step to C, another step to D, a step and a half to F, and a whole step back to the root note of G. So the G minor pentatonic scale is G, A sharp, C, D, F, G. So that basic scale So again, it's just the basic scale that we're building for the native flute. And so it's just really an easy example of how the step pattern is used to build a scale. Now let's go beyond that. Let's build a diatonic scale, which is a 7-note scale that most Western music is played in. It's the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do scale. So it's a scale we're really familiar with, but it's not a scale that's necessarily simple to play on the native flute. So we're going to build a major diatonic scale. And the step pattern for this scale is a whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So for this example, let's build an A major diatonic scale. So here's the chromatic scale. The root note that we want to start with is A. So we start here at A. We go a whole step, that takes us to B. Another whole step takes us to C sharp. A half step, D. A whole step, E. A whole step, F sharp. A whole step, G sharp. And the final half step takes us back to A. So the scale for A major diatonic scale is A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, and back to A. Now let's play the A major diatonic scale on a native flute in the key of A. Now, you're going to have to do some cross fingerings and some other fingering patterns in order to do this, and that's where the fingering charts in the back of the basic native flute book that comes along with your flute is really helpful. So if you look at that, you could find all those notes and reference the fingerings that go along with them, so you can learn those specific fingerings to play that scale. So in this case, we're going to need the 6th hole, so I move the leather to the side. And we're going to need to do a half hole on the bottom note. So if I play that scale, it sounds like this. It's really different than the basic pentatonic minor scale that this flute plays. So if I play a melody in that, totally different feel. It's a really different feel to that scale than the minor pentatonic scale. So to recap the process of building a scale, you have the chromatic scale, which consists of all the notes in Western music. And then you create a subset of that. And you create that subset by knowing the step pattern of the specific scale that you want to build. For example, a diatonic scale, a major diatonic scale, a minor diatonic scale. You can find those step patterns. Once you know that step pattern, you start at your root note and you walk your way through. For example, the major diatonic scale, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Those are the notes you're going to play. Now you reference the fingering charts in the back of the beginning instructional booklet that comes with your flute. You find the exact fingering patterns that you'll need to learn in order to play that scale. Then you memorize that and you practice those. You play up and down that scale a bit until you remember those fingerings. And then you're just free to improvise and play just like you would in the pentatonic minor, just like when you're playing from your heart, except that you're playing these other fingering patterns, and it'll pull totally different melodies out of you. It'll create totally new ways of being creatively expressive with your music. Now the easiest way to build scales is to use the root note of the key of your flute. For example, if you have a flute in the key of A, use the root note of A. So you find a step pattern that you want, a scale that you want to build. The easiest way to do it is use that root note of A. If you have an F sharp, use the root note of F sharp. Whatever the key of your flute is, use that as the root note. It's going to be the simplest way to build scales in the beginning. Eventually, you might want to try building it with other root notes, but one of the limitations of the native flute is it's, like I mentioned earlier, it's primarily a one-octave instrument. And what you'll find is if you start with a different root note than the key of your flute, you might not be able to reach all the notes in that scale. As you go up, the flute might not have the range to hit those higher notes that are required to play that full scale. So in the beginning, it's just easiest if you use that root note of the key of your flute. So to review, the native flute is a chromatic instrument, meaning that within the octave range of its notes, it can play all the notes in the chromatic scale. Now what that means is that a lot of other scales are available. So by learning the step patterns of a scale and using the key and the fingering charts of your flute, you can take a root note, create a scale, and see if your flute will be able to play it. Now, if you are interested in playing a scale in a specific key that your flute doesn't have the range to achieve, you might consider finding another flute, buying another flute that's based in that key, and that way you can start achieving and playing in these other keys as well. Now the final topic I'm going to go over is another naming convention, and that is the names of the notes with respect to their distance from the root note. Now this is a topic that has multiple facets to it. If you want to learn more about music theory, there's a ton of resources online, or I'd suggest maybe taking a class at your local community college. Now for this section, I'm going to be referencing the A major diatonic scale, but the information applies to any major diatonic scale. And that's really a fundamental scale when it comes to Western music. So that's why I'm using it in this way. To start, Let's look at the step pattern for a major diatonic scale. We see root note, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Now each of these intervals has a name with respect to that root note. They are the root note, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, and then we go back to the root note again. So now let's look at an A major diatonic scale as an applied example. Using the step formula, we build the scale. We have the root note of A, a whole step B, a whole step C sharp, a half step D, a whole step E, whole step F sharp, whole step G sharp, and the half step takes us back to the root note again of A. Now let's name them. The root note is A, B is the second, C sharp is the third, D is the fourth, E is the fifth, F sharp is the sixth, and G sharp is the seventh. And the way that you would talk about this is you would say the fifth is E. So in the scale of A, major diatonic, a fifth is an E, a third is a C sharp, a sixth is an F sharp. Now this knowledge comes in handy when you're talking about notes that harmonize. And it also comes in handy when you're playing two flutes together that are different keys. Now in general, the notes that harmonize well are the root note, the third, and the fifth. And to me, an interval of a fifth is the most pleasing. So when you're playing two flutes together, you would want to play flutes that are a fifth apart. So for example, if you have a flute in the key of A fifth from A is E. And so you'd want to play A and E together because that has an interval of a fifth. And those flutes will sound nice together. You could also play an interval of a third, but in general I don't find that, personally my ear doesn't find that to be as pleasing, but it's personal preference. But a fifth tends to be pretty standard. It's a really nice sound. Now a good thing to note is that the flutes don't need to be in the same octave, meaning you could play a flute in A that's a middle A, a mid-range, mid-tone flute, and a E that's a bass flute, or the opposite, or any combination thereof. A great way to hear how these notes harmonize with each other is by using a triple flute, where you can play all three notes together. So our triple flute is based in the key of A, so we'll play the root note, which is A here, we'll play a fifth, which is E here, and we'll play a third, which is C sharp here. So here is the root note. Here's a third, C sharp. And here's a fifth, E. Now here's a root and a third together. The root and the fifth. And here's all three together. So when this information, the root, the third, and the fifth, where this comes in handy is when you're playing with other people. Now playing two flutes that are both the same root note, meaning like two A's, two D's, two G's, no matter what octave they are, is always going to sound really good together. But knowing this now, you know you can play a root and a third or a root and a fifth together as well, and it'll sound really good. So it gives you a lot of diversity and understanding when you're playing with other people as to what two flutes will go together well. So to review, the notes in a major diatonic scale can be named with respect to the root note. You have the root note, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh. In general, the notes that harmonize best are root note, third, and fifth. If you're playing two flutes together and both of them are the root note, so both are in the same key, then they're going to harmonize beautifully. Another combination of flutes that will harmonize very nicely is the root and the fifth, and also the root and the third. And I find that the root in the fifth is more pleasing to my ear than the root in the third, so I tend to use flutes that are a fifth apart. Now, these are the general guidelines, but you ought to try different things. If you have two flutes that happen to be a sixth apart or a seventh apart or whatever it is, go ahead and play with it and see what it sounds like. See if it's pleasing or not. You know, by experimenting, you'll find things that might be outside the realm of these guidelines that really work for you. Or it might just help solidify and create an understanding of where these guidelines come from and where they've been created and why this theory has built the way it is. It's important to experiment and just really enjoy yourself. That's what the native flute and what music is all about. I went over a lot of information in this basic theory section. If you didn't grasp it all, it's very understandable. It's a lot of information. Go back and look at it every once in a while and you'll absorb new stuff and find you'll understand different things in new ways. But understanding theory is really helpful in allowing us to play and express ourselves musically in new ways. It's a fascinating part of music, and I hope you get a lot out of it.